thank you everybody for being prompt. And I would like to echo that thanks there from Mim for attending this afternoon. So as you will have seen, hopefully, if you've been watching the videos that we've been sending out this week, we have moved on to a new topic, which is financial accountability. So if you've managed to see those videos that are on the YouTube, Crane YouTube site, then you'll have got a bit of an overview, but we're going to look in a little bit more detail at staff this afternoon. So I recognize that people will be from different circumstances, different organizations, and so it's quite hard to to give detail on particular areas of finance because it might be different depending on your circumstances. So we're going to sort of look at an overview, and hopefully you can apply to your own organizations. Obviously as well, some people joining might be finance staff particularly, and others might be managers, directors, or other staff interested in learning more about QIS. So I apologize if it seems quite basic to some people, but we all have room to improve, I believe, within our organizations. So hopefully as we go, you can pick up some ideas to improve the processes. So we're going to look at 4 standards that are relevant to the topic of staff. So these are the QIS standards for this topic. The first one is all staff are aware of and recognize their financial responsibilities. So before we consider whether the staff are aware of their responsibilities, we should look at the role of the managers in implementing those responsibilities. I wonder if anybody listening could, either in the chat or with the microphone, just share what some financial responsibilities might be within your organizations. It could be either your own responsibilities or other people's. Okay, so Mim says reviewing requests. So that would be a role of a manager maybe, or a line manager. Raising requests, thank you. So that would maybe be the role of all staff in the organization. So some staff will have, basically all staff at some level will have some financial responsibilities. Thank you, Hope. So Hope says accounting for money used. That's a really key area, that it's not just the process of getting the money, but also reporting and accounting for that money afterwards. Preparing payments, yes. Okay, so we'll move on there, but just to think about, maybe you could look at your processes within your organization and list all of the responsibilities that are required within your processes. So do managers know what their own financial responsibilities are? Hopefully for some well-established organizations, you should know what your financial responsibilities are. But occasionally there are things that get missed because people don't realize that it's their job or their role. So it's always worth having an evaluation of that to say, do we all know what the financial responsibilities are? And then for managers, do you know what the individuals in your team are responsible for? If you are very organized, you might have a sort of matrix of responsibilities so that you know the flow of the processes, that one person, for example, if we take the example from of raising requests, the staff member would need to raise that request and submit to a line manager perhaps, and the line manager would authorize that and pass on to a finance team member, and the finance staff would then be responsible for processing that payment if it needs further authorization. So you need to think about what processes are in place there. And then responsibilities should be included in written job descriptions and in a finance policy where that's relevant. So one of the key financial principles is consistency. So making sure that things are always done in the same way, so that there's no room for cutting corners or for doing things not in a correct way. So having a finance policy will help you make sure that things are done the same way all the time. You might also consider writing some standard operating procedures, some SOPs for jobs that get done regularly within finance, so that anybody either covering a role or some new staff would always know the way that things are done within your organization. So most finance roles are cyclical. What I mean by that is that usually on a monthly basis, you'll have the same jobs coming up, and again quarterly and annually. So every month you're going to need to make sure that the banks are reconciled, that the payments are processed, that the payroll is processed. So in my own experience, I found that it's very useful to have maybe a checklist or just a very clear process of what gets done by who and when, so that nothing is missed. Especially this is important with the checks of your financial of your accounts. For example, reconciling and making sure that any journals are entered or anything like that. It's very useful to make sure that nothing is missed month to month. You also might want to consider all of your external financial responsibilities. For example, reporting to donors, completing an audit once a year, tax compliance. There might be others that people can think of. Okay, so the next standard is that all financial duties are shared between at least 2 people. So this is a really key standard in making sure that there's really protection is in place for staff and for the organization. Because although I'm sure that many of us who have joined are Christian, possibly, we'd like to believe that would give us integrity in what we do. But unfortunately, we can never just assume that is the case for all of our staff or for all of our people involved. So we, rather than just hoping that that's the case, as we do, of course, we need to put protection in place there. So one way that we can do that is making sure that there's a separation of duties, which means that at least 2 people will be involved in any financial process. And what that looks like in practical terms, it might be making sure that there are 2 signatories on a bank account, or at least 2 signatories, and requiring 2 signatures in an organization bank account. So that would mean that one person can't just sign a check for themselves, for example, or a check for somebody they know without at least one other person knowing. Of course, there's still a risk there in that 2 people could collude with each other. So, as much as you can protect against that, the more the better, really. There should be other sort of controls in place to prevent that from happening as well. But this also means, in terms of handling cash, for example, you should make sure that wherever possible, more than one person is involved in, for example, receiving the cash, and then another person would be banking it. So it's not, the whole process is not overseen by just one person. Okay, so we'll move on to the next standard, which is authority for financial resources is clearly delegated from the governing body through the line management structure. So it is clear who is responsible for what and within what limits. Okay, so we sort of have covered that in the previous standards, by people knowing their financial responsibilities, but it's important to note as well that this should come from the governing body of the organization. So for NGOs, that would probably be the board. I'm not sure, in schools it might look a little different, depending on the structure of your organization, but there should be a clear sort of hierarchy of who is responsible for what. And for example, this might mean that if you have petty cash, for example, you might have a limit on how much can be withdrawn at one time, without, say, for a small amount, it might just need one person to authorize, someone in the finance team, for example. Or if it's a larger amount, it might need more than one person to authorize. This could be important in procurement, especially. If you have grants, if you're receiving larger grants, often donors might require you to have certain procurement procedures, and so it's very important to have again, it goes back to consistency. Within your policy, you should know what those limits are for each expenditure. For example, if your organization was wanting to buy a vehicle, you would not just have one member of staff who decides, we want to buy this vehicle, and go out and spend that money. Of course, you're going to have a procurement process where people decide the best value for money, and then also the authorization process that would probably need to go to the board or to the higher governing authorities, governing bodies there. Yeah, and again, that's also helpful for budget monitoring, since if multiple people can just make decisions on how much money they can spend, there's a risk there that budget will be spent in the wrong place, or that it will be misused. And the final standard that we're going to look at is that all staff, finance staff and others, receive adequate training to carry out their financial responsibilities. Depending on the size of your organization, staff may be covering multiple roles. So I know of some organizations within the Crane network, for example, that have one member of staff who is responsible for the administration and the finance. And so we understand that people might not be qualified in the sense of having a degree in bookkeeping or whatever that looks like. So how can you help your staff? How can you make sure that they have the adequate skills and knowledge for their role? Obviously, this comes down to the capacity within your organization as well. You might not have capacity for, training all of your staff to degree level, for example. But it is a consideration to see whether, for example, if there is a budget for training, whether your finance staff could benefit from particular courses. It's also worth considering, even if your staff do have the relevant qualifications, whether they would benefit from particular areas. Sometimes, often within finance, for example, with tax, or with particular ways of accounting, sometimes the rules are changed, and it's good to keep up with the relevant advice on that. So it's possible that staff would still need to continue receiving that training. This also includes how you train your staff when they're new, when you take new staff on board. So you'll need to consider what that looks like within your organization. Maybe your finance team are the ones that would train your new staff in the financial processes, but it's important that as staff join, that they're aware of what needs to happen, so that you can maintain your consistency. It is also worth mentioning, I just have a link here to a website called Humentum, I think it's pronounced. It used to be called Mango, and you'll find some really useful resources there if you're looking particularly for finance information. And the standards that we use are actually developed from this material. So if you want to go more in depth, it's worth checking. There's an opportunity for questions. I'm not sure actually how much time we have remaining, but if anybody has any questions relating to those standards that we've shared, then please feel free.
Thank you very much, Becca. We have 10 minutes to take questions, so you can write them in the chat and I will read them, or you can open your microphone. So all your questions about how people are involved in managing finance. We'll get on to how the paperwork works in future weeks, but in terms of people's roles and responsibilities. So if you have a question, we are ready. Becca, while people are thinking,
yes,
let me ask a question. When you have a network or an organization where maybe there's only one full-time staff member, or whether they're paid or not, there's only really one person, what would you advise for how they handle their separation of duties?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm sure that some people have direct experience of that, so they might want to chip in there as well. But I would say that in that case, it doesn't, first of all, it doesn't need to be paid members of staff necessarily, as you mentioned. Perhaps if you only have one paid member of staff, but you also have some volunteers involved, that could be a route that you would sort of involve other people. But also to note there, obviously, you would want to make sure these were well-established volunteers, and you're not just giving someone a large amount of responsibility if you're not sure, that they are trustworthy in that sense or something. So if, in terms of depositing money in the bank, for example, sometimes banks would only allow a named person to be that link with the bank, and therefore you might not have that opportunity to share that duty. So the other thing I would say there is that if it is impossible, as in one sense, to separate those duties. That the other important things there would be communication and documentation. So what I mean by that is, for example, if there was an instance where one person was handling the cash, you would make sure that the board, for example, was aware of that and be very clear on what that looks like in terms of the processes. And so particularly with documentation, we will cover sort of paperwork later in the topics, but it would be making sure that every income was very clearly recorded, signed for by the person receiving and by the person giving, so that it was very clear how much money had been received, and then clear documentation of money that's stored and money that's paid into the bank, for example. I don't know if anybody else wants to share within their experience how you manage that separation of duties. Jonathan shared in the chat there, he said, for one full-time staff member and of particular the treasurer and the board chair in the management of the finances. Yes, exactly, Jonathan, thanks for that. So, so obviously for a smaller organization, the board would probably need to take a much more, direct role in terms of especially finances.
Becca, I have a question that's been sent to me here.
Okay.
Would you recommend that a volunteer acquires a training or skill on behalf of the organisation and then share with it? So would you train volunteers, I think is the question.
Yeah, okay, so I think that goes back to the capacity again of your organisation. So if obviously if you have a volunteer who you think will only be with you for a short time, there's no point in sort of tunneling resources into that person, and if you're not going to get the benefit of that, if that makes sense. But at the same time, if it's something which is sort of easily acquired, you could it might be a good opportunity for a volunteer to take that on board and then to sort of help the organization in one particular area. But again, I think within the question there, it's sort of implied that that would be shared with the rest of the staff then as to how to carry out that particular role. I don't know if that has answered the question, but I think that, yeah, using volunteers is always a great resource where that's available. But obviously with finance, it's very important to make sure, again, coming back to consistency, you'll hear that a lot from me, that if you are sort of wanting a temporary person to take on a role, it's worth documenting how that role is done, so that when that person then moves on, you're not left with a role that you can't or don't know how to fulfill.
Rebecca, I'm thinking about small local church. Mm-hmm. When we get our money, we spend as led by the Spirit and as needs arise. Sometimes the pastor has some money, salary to support him, but not. What would you advise us to be able to manage our money well?
Sorry, Paul, I couldn't hear you completely there, but I think you're talking about the church setting in terms of I don't know if you could clarify, like, do you mean like receiving the money or deciding how the money is spent? Deciding
how the money is spent.
Okay.
Because it's by the Spirit.
Yeah. Unfortunately, although the spirit should be involved in church matters. I think it's safe to say, like, you'll always need a committee of some sort in place that makes those decisions, whether that's, you know, a board, a committee, you know, the sort of finance department of your organization, even if that is a church. You know, there won't be a situation where one person can just decide on how to use that resources of that organization, because as stewards of that money, it might not be appropriate for one person to decide if that's the case. Now, there might be a point in a church, for example, where, yeah, somebody recognizes the need that is, you know, particular family needs support, or this pastor needs a raise, as you said. But there should be a process where that kind of gets presented and approved by multiple people, not just the difficulty comes, I think, with maybe with churches where people just are free with the resources of the organization, because it's not necessarily fair to say, for example, those who are giving money, who have understood the resources to be going to a particular destination, when they're just then diverted, and you get the risk there of misuse of money. So I don't know if Paul, I'm sure you can add more from your experience, but if you'd agree with me there.
That's helpful.
Becca, there's a comment from Frida in the chat. She says, it's good practice to have periodic trainings for both finance and non-finance staff for the purpose of being up to date with changes in guidelines and principles in financial guidelines and regulations.
Yep, definitely.
And then Jonathan,
yeah, as I said, I'm sorry.
Thank you for this discussion. I like the fact that everyone in the organisation should know their financial role in the organisation. We often note that there is a conflict of interest between the finance and programmes department, a thing which we can easily be solved if we understand the financial role in the organisation and how it should be executed. Jonathan, just to note there that the conflict of interest, I think, is a particular financial term which I will ask Becca to comment on. But I think what you're saying is maybe a conflict of understanding. So Becca, do you want to explain a conflict of interest?
Yes, so a conflict of interest would be, in financial terms, would be, for example, where somebody has a particular interest in, for example, if a board member was also a board member of a different organization, and those two organizations were involved somehow in, you know, one paying the other for services or for any reason. If that board member was instrumental in negotiating those costs, that would be a conflict of interest, because it would be in the interest of that board member to you know, have a good deal for their other organization, for example. So a conflict of interest would be any sort of transaction where the people involved have maybe an ulterior motive, if I can say that. So hopefully you've understood. But I just want to go back to what Jonathan said there, in that just back to what I said at the very beginning, that finance is the role of everybody in the organization, really. I think often people will sort of have a disclaimer if they are program staff, for example, in saying finance is nothing to do with me. But really, you know, especially in the areas of budget monitoring and in making sure that the activities that happen are relevant to the aims of the organization. And especially, as I think Hope said, you know, accounting for the money used, it really is a role for everybody within the organization. So I think we've just got 3 minutes left. So time for one quick question if there's anything burning. Or just to go back to what Paul's comment says, who decides that we are using money well, especially if we have spent money to do activities or met the needs of the people? I'm not sure if that's a question or if it's a comment, but just to say that obviously that depends again on what type of organization you are, but a key thing there will be being clear on the aims of your organization and in the aims of your activities. So if you're being funded by a particular donor, you will have agreed with those aims of your project, and that will determine whether you're meeting, it's not just a case of spending all the money necessarily. It will be a case of whether you've spent it meeting those objectives.
Okay, Becca, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody listening. We will post this to YouTube for you to be able to review, and otherwise we look forward to the next part next week.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all your comments and questions. That's a good discussion, and yeah, we'll join again for the webinar next week. Thank you.